He stood at the gate just past dusk, one hand gripping the rusted metal as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His voice was low, almost apologetic, when he told me my husband's grave wasn't empty. I didn't believe him, at least, not until I saw what he carried wrapped in that weather-stained cloth. My husband, Daniel, was buried 3 years ago on a hill just outside our small, pine-lined town, a quiet place where the wind seems to hold its breath. After losing him, I built my days carefully, like stacking dishes that might shatter if handled too quickly. The people here knew not to bring him up, and I knew better than to visit his grave too often. But everything I'd managed to keep still began to tremble the night a stranger leaned against my gate, saying Daniel's burial had not been what it seemed. His presence cracked open something I had sealed tight. The light was fading when I first saw him, just that thin strip of gold slipping behind the pines, turning the fence lines into silhouettes. I remember thinking the evening felt heavier than usual, like the world was holding its breath for reasons it didn't want to share. The man stood at my gate with his hands wrapped around the metal bars, not shaking the way a beggar might, not bold like a salesman, just holding on, as if the gate was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't call out, he just looked at me. And somehow, I knew he carried something I wasn't ready to receive. I'd been sweeping the porch, pushing dust into neat little lines like that might keep the past from drifting back across my doorstep. The air smelled like wet pine and the kind of cold that settles into the bones if you let it. It was the hour of the day I used to like best, the quiet between chores and darkness. But that evening, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the birds went silent too early, or the way the wind cut through the trees without touching my skin, or maybe it was simply the fact that I recognized the look in the man's eyes before he even spoke. Grief recognizes its own. I set the broom aside and stepped down from the porch, the boards creaking behind me in a way that sounded almost like hesitation. As I walked toward him, he straightened out much, just enough to show he'd been waiting for this moment. His coat hung loose around his frame, the collar pulled tight like he'd spent hours in the cold. He looked like the kind of person who'd lived more nights outdoors than in. Still, there was something careful about him, a gentleness, a man trying not to disturb a wound he could already see bleeding. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, polite. I nodded but didn't answer. You learn not to fill silence to ice. Some truths only come if you leave room for them. "My name's Carter," he continued. I'm a groundskeeper, just for the season. Cemetery up the hill." The word cemetery hit the air like a dropped stone. I felt my stomach draw tight. People avoid that place around me, even in conversation. They think they're protecting me, or themselves. I rested a hand lightly on the gate, steadying myself. "What do you need, Carter?" He swallowed, eyes flicking down, then back to mine. "It's about a man buried there. Daniel Ward." My husband's name, soft and sudden, like a breath I'd forgotten how to take. I told myself he'd found nothing, that this was a misunderstanding, born from small-town paperwork or grave plots shifting in the rain. Nothing more. But a part of me, the part I'd locked away, sat up sharply. Carter shifted his weight and reached into the deep pocket of his coat. The movement was slow, hesitant, as if he feared I might run. I couldn't. My feet felt anchored to the dirt. "I wasn't digging," he said, almost pleading. "I need you to know that. I wasn't looking for trouble." He pulled out a small cloth, dark with soil and creased from being folded too long. He held it like it might crumble, or like I might crumble. "I found this," he said. I didn't want to take it. I didn't want anything from that place. Not a flower, not a memory, not a truth. But Carter extended his hand through the gate, and something in the way he looked at me, apologetic, scared, certain, made me reach out. The cloth felt cold, damp. When I unwrapped it, the metal caught the last thread of sunlight and flickered, just once, enough to make my breath stall in my chest. A stainless steel, morgue tag, oval thin, a number stamped into the surface. I didn't need to read it. I knew it before my eyes even focused. Daniel's number. I'd seen it the day they called me to identify, when the world was too loud and too bright, and too cruel to hold on to. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Where did you find this?" Carter's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into the fabric of his coat sleeve. "Near his grave," he said, half buried, like someone meant to hide it but not too well. The wind pushed against the trees then, as if trying to hush everything. I stared at the tag resting in my palm. Its weight small but unbearable. It should have been sealed in the coffin, bound to Daniel's body before they lowered him into the earth. It shouldn't have been here, and definitely not in my hand. "I think someone dug," Carter said softly. "Not far, not deep, but enough." I shook my head. "Once. Twice. hard enough to make the world blur. No, you're mistaken. You must be fur. He met my eyes, and there was no comfort in them, just honesty, raw and trembling. I wish I was. Something inside me, something fragile, carefully mended, began to pull apart along an old seam. I tried to hand the tag back, but Carter didn't take it. He stepped back instead, as if the thing between us wasn't metal at all, but a boundary we'd both crossed unknowingly. I thought maybe it was from another site, he said, an older burial, a misplaced marker. He shook his head slowly. But the number? It matches, and the ground above him, it's been disturbed recently. The way he said recently made a coldness settle behind my ribs. I gripped the gate, knuckles pale. Grief has a way of making ghosts out of normal things. Sounds, shadows, memories. But this wasn't grief playing tricks. This was proof. This was intrusion. This was something reaching up from a place meant to stay closed. Why would someone do that? I whispered. Carter didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the darkening path behind him, where the first crickets were beginning to sing. When he looked back at me, there was a tired sorrow in his voice. I don't know, but people don't disturb graves without purpose. The sky folded into deeper blue. The air thickened. I felt the whole world leaning in, waiting for the moment I would break or refuse or simply walk away. But I did none of those things. I closed my fingers around the tag, feeling the imprint of the number press into my skin. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt the edges of the truth shifting, coming undone. Carter took a step back from the gate, giving me space I didn't realize I needed. I'm sorry, he murmured, but you deserved to know. Then he turned and started down the road, his footsteps fading into the growing dusk. I stayed there long after he disappeared, the metal tag cooling in my hand, the silence deepening around me. The night pressed close, whispering questions I wasn't ready to answer. Why was Daniel's tag above? And what else might be waiting beneath the soil that once claimed him? I let the gate swing shut behind me, its echo low and hollow like the beginning of something opening. The path to the cemetery was still wet from the night's rain, the kind that settles into the soil and makes every step sound softer than it should. Morning light drifted through the pines in thin, wavering lines, like the world hadn't fully decided to wake yet. I walked alone, listening to the quiet, listening for something I didn't know how to name. The air tasted of damp needles and old stone. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, then stopped, as if even it didn't want to disturb what waited on that hill. I hadn't meant to go there so early. I'd told myself last night that Carter's visit was just a mistake. That grief had settled into my ears and twisted his words. I'd slept poorly, waking again and again to the memory of that cold metal tag against my skin. By dawn, I stopped pretending the lie could comfort me. The walk felt longer than it used to. When Daniel died, people had offered to drive me up the hill to see his grave, as though distance itself was another cruelty. But I'd always chosen to walk. Walking made the world hold still long enough for the heart to keep up. That morning, though, the world didn't feel still. The pines leaned as if watching me pass. The wind moved through them softly at first, then in a sharper way, like it had changed its mind about being gentle. When I reached the cemetery gate, the metal was cold under my hand. I paused there, breathing in the scent of damp earth. I told myself I just needed to see the grave. Confirm nothing was wrong. Lay the worry back to rest the way I had tried to lay Daniel. But the moment I stepped inside, the quiet changed. It wasn't peaceful or familiar. It was expectant. Like walking into a room someone had just left. I looked toward Daniel's plot. The stone was exactly where it should be, clean and straight. For a moment, relief rose in me. Silly, brief. Then I noticed the ground behind it. A slight rise, a subtle dip. Not messy, not obvious, just wrong. As if the earth had been touched, shifted, persuaded to reveal something before it was smoothed back into place. My breath caught. I knelt without thinking, my knees sinking into the wet needles. My fingers brushed the soil, cool and loose beneath the surface crust. Not rain, not animals, not time. A hand had been here. The caretaker's shed sat not far from the row of old cedars. I walked toward it, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make my steps sound normal. The door was open, propped with a brick. And inside I found the caretaker, a man named Rupert Toilstaining, a pair of shears. He looked up at me with a little too much alertness. Morning, need something. His tone was friendly, but his eyes flicked past me, out toward the graves. I wanted to ask, I said slowly, if there's been any work done on my husband's plot. He shook his head too quickly. No ma'am, not a thing. Everything's been quiet up there. Quiet. The word felt borrowed. I stepped a little farther in, letting my shadow cross the tools hung neatly on the wall. There's fresh soil behind the stone, I said. It looks moved. Rupert set down the shears. Not gently, not loudly, just carefully enough that the silence afterward felt wrong. Well, he said, rubbing his palms on his coveralls. Animals dig sometimes. Foxes, mostly. Rain shifts things too. You'd be surprised how often we have to go tidy it up. Did you tidy it? His mouth tightened. No, but one of the boys maybe. Hard to say, there were no boys. Only him and the seasonal worker who came twice a week. I let the lie sit between us like a fog. Is something wrong? He asked, pretending he didn't already know the answer. I didn't respond. I just watched him. His eyes darted again toward the hill. Toward Daniel. Something in my chest hollowed out. I left the shed before my voice failed me. Back at Daniel's grave, I crouched again. The grass felt colder the second time. My fingers trembled as I pressed into the dirt, feeling that same wrong shape beneath. Not a collapse. Not a sink. Something raised. Like something beneath the soil had been lifted. Then not quite lowered back in place. I reached instinctively for the small morgue tag in my coat pocket, the one Carter had given me last night. The metal was still cold, as though it remembered where it had come from. I held it in my fist, staring at Daniel's name etched into the stone. A gust of wind pushed through the pines, then strong enough to rattle the branches overhead. Their shadows flickered across the headstones. For a moment, I felt watched. Not by a person, not by a presence I could name, just watched. My breath slowed. My thoughts quieted. And somewhere inside the stillness, something settled into place. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't my grief trying to shape meaning out of dirt. Someone had been here. Someone had dug. Someone had opened what should never be opened. I ran my fingertips along the soil again, letting the truth seep in with the cold. The cemetery had always felt like the end of something final, sealed, finished, but today, it felt like the beginning of a question. Behind me, the wind hissed lightly through the trees, almost like a whisper. What was taken? What was moved? What was left behind? I closed my eyes and tried not to imagine Daniel alone in the dark earth, disturbed by hands that had no right to touch him. When I stood, my legs felt unsteady. The tag weighed more than it should have in my pocket, like a stone tied to a memory I wasn't ready to unravel. I looked at the grave one last time before turning away. The pine branches swayed gently now, calmer, as if relieved I'd noticed what they'd been trying to show me all along. As I walked back through the gate, the quiet followed me down the path. Not comforting, not threatening, just waiting. Waiting for me to understand why Daniel's grave wasn't left alone. Waiting for what I would do next. The porch light hummed like a tired thing when Carter sat down on my stoop. Careful, as if the boards might break under the truth. He folded his hands around a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and he watched the steam leave it the way you watch a small animal breathe. The town had already gone quiet, porches dark. Windows blind, but the air between us felt full of something spoken and too heavy to leave unsaid. He put the cup down without touching it and reached into his coat again. I felt the room tilt toward whatever he carried, like the house was listening for the sound of a secret unwrapping. I hadn't invited anyone inside. I had meant for the evening to be a small ritual. Heat the kettle, set a plate of biscuits for myself, sit with the radio low and pretend the world still knew how to keep its promises. When Carter first knocked, I thought it'd send him away another rattle of the town's complications that I didn't have room to carry. But his eyes were not the color of strangers. They were the color of someone who had seen things small towns bury and come back with their hands full of questions. He told me he worked at cemeteries in 3 counties last year. He told me about low stones and tired caretakers. About the way the ground remembers footsteps long after the footprints vanish. His voice was flat, shaped by practice. That made it worse. People who practice telling terrible things do not do so lightly. I kept my kettle unwatched, feeling the heat rise in the kitchen like a held breath. The porch smelled of old wood and rain. My hands folded into my lap the way they had the months after Daniel died, safe, predictable. I wanted to ask him to leave. I wanted to ask him to keep the world as it was. Instead, I let him speak. There is a private ledger in grief where every small disturbance is recorded. I had been keeping mine neat, avoiding lines that led to anywhere painful. Carter opened his mouth and began to write in it with the blunt edge of a fact. He set the coffee down between us again and then, carefully, pulled the cloth-wrapped tag from his pocket. The cloth was damp at one corner, soil dark on its surface. He didn't offer it the way you offer a gift. He offered it the way you offer a wound, with a softness meant to steady the recipient, not to ease the pain. You know these, he said simply. Morgue tags. They go in with the body. Always. His hands were steady, but his voice cracked on the small word always. It emphasized a rule I'd learned only once in a hospital room that smelled of bleach and fluorescent light. Rules aren't supposed to be negotiable. I turned the tag over in my palm like it might transform if I looked long enough. The metal was nicked. The number stamped into it caught the porch light and glinted. I could almost see the hospital corridor again the way the lights blurred at the edges. The silence that presses in when people are too afraid to breathe loud. Carter told me he'd seen tags turned up before, not by children, scavenging for anything shiny, not by animals. He said the last time, the tag had been placed at the foot of a garden beside a mailbox, like an offering. He had watched the neighbor's face change when they found it, watched the way the community folded around the secret, and then refused to speak its name. The world learns to cope with strange rituals in small places by inventing polite denials. Anger rose in me like heat, not the hot, blinding anger of movies, but a slow, sharp tightening like a stitch pulling in old fabric. Daniel had been taken from me. People had rallied. They had brought casseroles. They had held vigils. Everything had been as it should be, or so I thought. If someone wanted to speak to me, why through him? Why through the place where he lay quiet? The question sat heavy, jagged, and real. Carter leaned forward. They don't disturb graves for nothing, he said. Not usually. Not without saying something by it. His fingers tapped the tag, light but urgent. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's mercy. Sometimes it's debt. Debt. The word landed like a stone. He told me about a woman he'd met once. Her husband's marker had mud on it despite a week of no rain. She found a note tucked under a rock, paid no signature, no explanation. For months afterward, people in that town claimed they slept better. As if the debt had been more than money, it had been something that suffocated them in their sleep. It became a story they told at the diner. Carter's point wasn't the story. His point was the method. Graves touched as messages, as transactions, as punctuation marks in lives that needed resolving. I thought of the way Daniel used to fold his hands in his lap, the small line, a seam left by years of holding back words. I thought of secret things husbands sometimes carry home because they don't want to make their wives worry, because this was the way men like him thought they could be kind, or brave, or safe. What would someone want to say with a tag? I asked. He didn't smile. He said that they saw him, that he wasn't alone, that someone remembers, or that someone wants something back. I realized then my anger had a shape. It wasn't only indignation that someone would touch his grave. It was fear, sharp and private, of what might be missing and why it mattered enough for someone to announce it with a small, cold piece of metal. The night settled like a shawl over the town. The kettle had gone cold on the stove. Carter stood to go. He left the tag on my table as if it were a proposition I had to consider alone. People like clarity, he said. When they can't speak, they leave signs. I watched him walk away down the lane. The porch light picked out the furrow of his neck as he moved, and then he was a silhouette blending with the dark. I sat with the tag under my palm and felt the weight of choices I hadn't expected to make. To ask questions that might reopen everything, or to set the metal back in a drawer and pretend the world had not rearranged itself tonight. I set it down on the table and closed my hands over it, listening to the house breathe. Who was leaving messages in the earth for me to find? And what would I be willing to uncover to read what they meant? The trail was a thin thing between the cedars, barely a scar in the undergrowth. Like someone had tried to walk and leave only a whisper. Dawn had not yet fully decided to come. The sky was the color of old cloth. I could hear my own boots in that quiet, but they sounded too loud, as if the world was listening for the next step. The pines made a slow, patient hush above me. I kept thinking of small, deliberate gestures. The way a hand smooths a pillow. The way someone pats a pocket to be sure what's still there. I followed the path because the path had been shown to me. And because once something is pointed out in the dark, it feels rude not to look. The unmarked path started at the edge of the cemetery where the grass thinned and the forest began to crowd in. There was no sign, no stepping stones, no lantern, nothing to mark the decision someone had made to take it. Just a faint crease in the earth that led downward. Away from the neat rows, into a place where the land felt like it still held its bargains with night. I paused, hand on the bark of a cedar. The ridge smelled like moss and something older, like damp cloth and time. Carter met me there, not saying much. He carried a thermos and the sort of stillness that doesn't need words. When you follow a path someone else has used, There's a strange intimacy to it, as if you're walking between their shoulders. I thought of how little I knew of the man who'd put my husband's tag on my porch. How little I knew of the people who touch graves for reasons I could not yet name. As we walked, the world narrowed, the crunch of needles, our breath fogging in front of our faces, the small sounds of a town that thought itself too far away to matter. I kept looking for the sign of recent movement: flattened ferns, broken twigs, anything that spoke the language of a human passing. The path felt purposeful, not the roaming way of an animal, but the ordered tread of someone who knew where they were going. There was a carefulness to the way I moved too. Grief teaches you to tread lightly around edges. I found myself measuring my steps like a promise. Halfway down, we found footprints. Not many, just 2 sets. Shallow but clear where the soil had given. They were unremarkable until you noticed what lay beside them. A smear of soil that looked like a glove had been dragged. A small crumpled wrapper, the thin thread of a ribbon. The prints were not recent enough to be smeared with morning dew, but fresh enough that the edges had not yet been claimed by the wind. Whoever made them had carried something heavy. Whoever made them had been careful. We followed the prints to an old storage shack sunk low into the hillside. Its roof bowed and its door hanging on one hinge. The lock was broken, as if someone had wanted easy entry. I could feel my heartbeat pick up in my throat. The inside smelled of oil and damp wood and things that sit untouched for too long. Tools leaned like soldiers against the wall. A lantern lay on its side with a smear of dirt along its base. A shovel rested against the work table, its blade dulled but not unused. Carter knelt and ran his fingers along the shovel's handle. "Not long," he said, still warm at the base. "Might be from earlier today." His voice had that controlled quality again, the one that means he'd been awake thinking. Watching maps in his head. On the table, half hidden beneath a rag, was a pair of gloves. One was torn at the finger. Inside it, something small and metallic, glinted like a promise or a threat. I didn't want to touch it, but I also couldn't not. My fingers closed around a small pocket knife with an etched handle. My thumb brushed the initials carved there, DW, and my breath left me all at once. The knife should have been buried with him. Daniel carried it for years, cutting twine, opening boxes, carving little tokens on scraps of wood when he was thinking. I remembered the way he'd absent-mindedly rub the nick where the metal met the wood when he was tired. I remember telling him once, half joking, to put it away if he loved it. He laughed and tucked it into his pocket. Now it was here, in my hand, oily dirt caught in the creases of the handle. I felt foolish for the tears that came, small, hot, immediate, because a metal object shouldn't make a whole life reassemble itself, but it did. It was proof that someone had been close enough to him after they closed the casket to take this thing back out. Proof that hands were in the night where only earth should be. Carter's jaw hardened. "They were prepared," he said quietly. "The way things are stacked. The gloves, the shovel. Someone didn't just pass through. They came with intent." The word intent settled between us like a verdict. I stood in a room of scent and shadow, the knife heavy in my palm. I thought of the morgue tag on my table at home, and the way it had felt impossibly small, and somehow huge at the same time. Here were 2 pieces of an argument, one metal, one stamped, both speaking of hands that moved where they shouldn't. Who would? I started. The question trailed off like a dropped stitch. I couldn't say it out loud because I suspected the answer would be worse than the not knowing. Carter met my eyes then, and for the first time there was worry that reached beyond professional concern. "If someone's taking things," he said, "they might be looking for something, or hiding something. Either way, they're not done." The shadow in the corner of the shack seemed to lean forward, listening. We left the shack the way you leave a stranger's house, quietly, as if not to wake it. The path back up felt different, less like a secret and more like the border of one. The knife was wrapped in my scarf, a small, foreign weight against my ribs. When we reached the gate, Carter hesitated. "There are stories about this sort of thing," he said. "People touch graves to send messages. They take pieces to make bargains. Sometimes they're trying to remember. Sometimes they're trying to remind others." I watched him walk away, the cedar shadows swallowing the shape of his shoulders. I stood with the knife in my hand, feeling the world rearrange itself by the smallest of objects. The pines were quiet above, but the air between them held a language I was only beginning to understand. What did they want with what belonged to him, and how far would I go to find out? The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and lemon oil, small town scents that make you feel you're inside a story someone else is telling. Mara arrived before I finished my first cup. She sat opposite me without looking at the window, like she'd practiced sitting down without making a scene. Her hands folded around the steaming mug as if it were a lifeline. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. We shared the kind of silence that had nothing to do with being polite and everything to do with surviving long nights. When she finally spoke, it was not about the tag or the knife. It was a slip of paper, folded twice, that she pushed across the table with a thumb that trembled more than she would admit. Mara is Daniel's sister in the way people are related to Weathersteady, familiar, sometimes impossible to ignore. After the funeral, she became the part of the family that kept the house from sagging. She brought casseroles, arranged flowers, and spoke in the right tone at town gatherings. We had agreed, unsaid, that some things would be shared and others kept like pins in a cushion. The morning she sat with me, the cafe buzzed around ooze 2 women at the counter, laughing too loud. The radio murmuring old country songs, but inside our corner, the year between us and Daniel's death felt thin, like tissue. She put the note on the table when the cup slammed down in her hands. Her fingers were rougher than I remembered. She avoided my eyes, the way a person avoids stepping on glass. For a moment, I thought she might have come to ask me to forget the tag. To let it dissolve the way some towns let trouble evaporate if you don't name it. Instead, she watched me, waiting, as if for permission to pull a string loose. When I opened the note, it was just a list dates in short words, neat enough to be methodical, sloppy enough to be human. March 3rd Post Office. April 12th by River. June 7th Parcel. Daniel's name sat at the top, written taller than the rest. The last line had a different ink, darker, as if added later. A date 2 months after his funeral. My throat closed around the air. I asked her where she'd got it, and she said she hadn't meant to show me. She said she found it tucked into a book Daniel used to leave by his chair. She said she'd folded it away because the handwriting frightened her. Loops and hooks that didn't belong to anyone we knew. As she spoke, the cafe noise faded into a thin hum, like a record played softly in the next room. Her voice made the paper reel in my hands. There was a tremor in her shoulder I hadn't noticed before. He promised he'd tell me, she said he'd explain. But he didn't get the chance. Her words stumbled over the shape of grief, and something else she wouldn't name. She kept returning to the same small gesture, folding the note, unfolding it, smoothing the crease with the same thumb. It was like watching someone press a bruise. When I asked if Daniel had been secretive, she laughed without humor. He kept things to himself, she said. Silly things, sometimes. He'd pretend they were nothing. But this isn't silly. She met my eyes then, finally, steady and raw. Do you remember him talking to someone on the phone? Late at night. Her question had the shape of an accusation and the softness of a plea. My mind fumbled back to the nights he'd come in after dusk, shrugging off his coat, the radio humming low. I remembered one Koa voice he'd not told me about, and the way he closed his eyes against the receiver. I'd asked nothing because asking felt like breaking something fragile. Now the silence between us felt like a locked door I'd purposely left unopened. Mara slid the note's last entry across the table. The date was circled, and beside it, a single word. Remember. It was not a command. It was a wound. I thought it was nothing, she said. I thought he was protecting me from some debt or trouble. Something that didn't belong to me. She flinched, as if expecting me to blame her for keeping secrets. But then Carter came to your gate, and when you said the tag, her voice cracked, and she left the sentence hanging like a knife. The coffee grew cold between us. The steam no longer rose. I felt the room tilt again, the way it did when a memory rearranged the furniture of a life. I realized, with the disorienting clarity of waking from a dream, that we had all been carrying pieces of a broken map. Daniel must have been trying to mark a trail, dates, places, things he thought would mean something if he couldn't speak them aloud. The idea of him building a breadcrumb path made my chest ache in a way I hadn't allowed. Shame and gratitude, all folded together. Mara whispered. I was ashamed to ask. I thought it was pride, or debt, or, I don't know. She reached across and touched my hand. Her thumb found the place where the morgue tag rested in my coat, the weight I had brought to the table without thinking. She didn't look at it, but her fingers went still. For a second, we were 2 women in a small town holding on to the same small, impossible fact. What if someone's been following those dates? She asked. The question felt ordinary and monstrous at once. We left the cafe together, into an afternoon that had lost its patience. The note burned in my pocket like a coal. Mara walked beside me, quieter than usual, as if the streets might hear things and decide to repeat them. Before we parted at the corner, she pressed something into my palm, a small slip of torn paper with an address scrawled on it and a single phrase, "Don't tell the police yet." Her eyes said what the words did not. Fear, yes, but also something like apology. She hugged me quickly, awkwardly, as if we were learning again how to touch without falling apart. As she walked away, the sky deepened into a blue that felt older than either of us. I stood with the paper in my hand and felt the list of dates bloom into a map I had to follow, or else let the truth remain buried with him. The shack smelled like rain and old oil when we walked back in that night. The kind of smell that remembers every hand that has ever opened its door. Carter carried a lantern. Its glass fogged at the edges, and the light it cast was small and cowardly against the corners. It made everything look like it might be hiding. I held the knife wrapped in my scarf close to my chest, feeling its shape through the fabric as if it were a secret I could still fold in on itself. The world narrowed to the circle of pale light and the sound of our breaths. I'd avoided the shack during the day because daytime made questions look like choresable, ordinary. Night changed that. Night turns things inward. It makes memory sharper, and fear more patient. I told myself the exhumed grief would make me brave, that seeing evidence would make decisions easier. Instead, standing beneath the low rafters, I felt clumsy. Like a stranger in my own life, Carter moved with the kind of quiet I trusted. He didn't rush or try to fill the silence. The lantern's glow pooled at his feet, throwing his shadow long across the wooden floor. The tiny sound of a drip somewhere behind a stack of boxes became too loud, like a metronome measuring out the moment before revelation. The knife in my scarf felt cold as an apostrophe. It was a thing from the man I had loved, small, practical, ordinary, and suddenly it was raised to the level of question. It made me think of how often people keep the objects of the dead as talismans, as if the metal could hold the shape of the person who once used it. I had taken it because waiting felt worse than taking, because proof, however small, suggested motion. Proof implied someone else's hand had been present. Carter glanced from the knife to the door and back to me. "I came back," he said simply. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I should look again." His mouth set into a line that suggested he'd been thinking of this place. Without deciding if he wanted to return, we moved through the shack like careful animals, each sound measured. The lantern made the dust visible suspended like a constellation. In the silence, the past felt almost tactile. We started with the obvious, the table, the tools, the corners where someone might have hidden something hurriedly. The lantern found the glove, the shovel, the lantern on its side. Then, beneath a loose plank by the back wall, Carter found the scrape fresh, small, a mark that matched the length of a blade. He knelt and pressed his fingers into it as if reading Braille. "They pried," he murmured. "Not with a shovel, a knife, something thin." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled just enough to make me notice. Under the plank, the wood was rough and the underside still smelled of sap. Someone had used a small tool to lever a space, careful, precise. It suggested a plan, not a panic. And in that hollow, wrapped in a punctured scrap of oilcloth, lay another thing, a small, leather-bound notebook, edges softened by handling. I didn't want to touch it. I wanted to leave it closed, like a mouth you don't force to speak. But Carter unfolded the oilcloth with fingers that had held all kinds of small, ugly truths before. The cover cracked softly as he opened it, the pages breathing out dust on inside. The handwriting was tight and cramped. The ink faded but legible in the lantern's glow. Names, dates, short phrases. I recognized Daniel's handwriting in a single line, an awkward curl of a letter he always made on the tail of his Y. My stomach dropped away. It was notation. It was counting. It was a ledger of things that I had not known to count. At the back of the notebook, tucked between pages, was a pressed scrap of fabric, brown, stained, and a photograph creased thin. The photo showed Daniel, younger, the knife at his belt, smiling in a way that made my throat ache. Someone had written on the back, "Keep until done." My fingers hovered over the paper like they might burn. The notebook changed the shape of the room. What had been suspicion slid into fact. The name Daniel in that cramped script felt like an echo answering its own call. Carter's face softened, but there was a hard line at the edges I couldn't unsee. "He kept notes," he said. "People who keep lists either owe someone, or they're trying to remember debts." He wrapped his hand around the lantern as if to keep its light from spilling. I began to read aloud, softly at first, then more firmly as the words anchored me. Dates matched those on Mara's list. Places lined up with the odd things we'd found. The tag, the knife. Each entry was a small, careful recordums listed with names like ingredients in a recipe. At the bottom of one page was a line that stopped mid-sentence. "If I can't," followed by a sudden blot of ink, like the pen had been dropped. My heart thudded a peculiar drum in my chest. The notebook suggested Daniel had been tracking something deliberate, meetings, exchanges, things promised or taken. The presence of the photograph and the fabric suggested a ritual. Something made of objects and memory. Carter set the notebook on the table and looked at me straight. "You should show this to Mara," he said. "She might know what some of this means." His tone held no judgment, only practicality. The words felt like a bridge constructed out of necessity, but I hesitated. The idea of laying the notebook's thin pages before my sister-in-law felt like opening a wound. I wasn't sure she could touch without bleeding. I thought of the note she gave me, the list folded into her pocket, and of the way she'd told me not to tell the police yet. Someone in our lives had been moving in the dark. Someone had been trying to stitch a path through it. The notebook was both map and accusation. Carter closed the lantern and the room sank into a gentle, protective dark. The words on the pages sat between us like coals that might warm or might burn. I wrapped the knife again and placed the notebook into my bag, feeling its weight like a promise I hadn't asked for. Outside, the night seemed thicker, as if it had been waiting for this little transaction to finish. We walked back up the path in silence. The pines whispered above, patient and unreadable. When the shack slid behind us and the town lights blinked awake in the distance, the world had shifted less like a place where secrets might be kept, and more like a place where secrets demanded settlement. The morning air smelled like turned earth and old coffee. Machines hummed somewhere distant, respectful, and the cemetery sat with its collars of mist. I stood at the edge of the pit with my hands in my coat pockets, feeling foolish for being there, for wanting proof that would not make the world crueler. The lid came up with a sound like a sigh. For a second everything held airlight, the small, private geometry of a life, and then the lid slid away and the smell of the coffin filled the hole like a remembered thing. We had arranged it the night before, because the idea of digging him up myself felt obscene, and because there are rules. You go to when the heart can't do the simplest things. The funeral director used polite words, family concerns, closure, as if those phrases could keep other people's eyes from dropping into corners where they didn't belong. I told myself that seeing him would end something. A rumor, a worry, the small, gnawing uncertainty that had lived in my chest since the tag and the knife. I wanted the plain, hard answer of the earth and the professionals. The morning light turned the fog into a thin sheet of gauze. A couple of men from the cemetery had come, formal, awkward, in the way men are when grief is not theirs to carry. Carter waited at the edge, like someone afraid his presence might be unwelcome. Mara came too, hands clenched around a thermos she never drank from. She didn't look at me. She looked at the pit as if it might explain itself. When the coffin was lifted, the air changed. The workers' voices went small. Tools set down made tiny sounds that felt disproportionate to the weight of the moment. I remember thinking how ordinary the wood looked, stained, nailed, familiar, ordinary as the table we ate at when he was alive. Ordinary. And suddenly the most important object in my life. I told myself to breathe slowly. I told myself that it would be all right. Those were the old sentences you tell yourself, so the ground doesn't swallow you faster. They eased the lid back like it was something fragile. Light met the dark inside, thin as a blade. For a moment, I couldn't place anything, only an impression of stillness, of folded things arranged into the shape of a man. Then I saw him. Daniel. The line of his jaw familiar even in the quiet of a coffin. The suit he'd liked. The little fold of his handkerchief at his breast. The world tightened in my chest as if someone had reached in and given the organ a squeeze. But then my eyes dropped to where hands should have been. Blank sleeves rested there, folded over the body in the way hands sometimes are when you want a person to look whole. The linen lay smooth where fingers should crease it. A small coldness spread through my limbs, precise as frost. I felt my feet unsteady. The men around me exchanged looks, small, professional gestures like the quick shifting of paper. "We'll need to document this," one said, the phrase sounding like a bell toll. Someone muttered about police and protocol. Their words skittered at the edge of my hearing. I heard them like noise underwater. I heard the creak of the lid as it was set aside again. Mara's breath hitched. "What do you mean, miss?" she asked, and her voice came out small but fierce. I found that I could not make any sound at all. My mouth moved as if to call his name and nothing formed. The men spoke in terms I almost didn't understand: log numbers, chain of custody, embalmer's notes, but one sentence grounded me. He was whole when he went in. Whole. The memory of his hands flashed, calloused, patient, the ones that had held mine at odd hours, warm and steady. Where were they? Who had taken them? And why? The director closed his notebook with a soft thud and looked at me like a man measuring how much bad news a person could bear. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "there are thefts. Sometimes, there are mistakes. We have to be methodical." The words were not comfort. They were a method. I thought of the tag in my pocket, the knife wrapped in my scarf, the notebook we had found. The objects formed a bleak mortar of evidence. Someone had been there after they closed the coffin. Someone had reached in, Someone had taken parts of him. I felt anger arrive, slow and cold. Not the loud kind, you tell stories about the kind that draws crowds and makes headlines, but a steadier, aiming feeling. It found the men who talked around me, and looked them in the eye. Who authorized the removal? I asked, my voice small but held like a thread. The men shuffled. Rules recited. Records promised. The director's hand touched my shoulder in a practiced sympathy I wanted to shake off. Mara's face had gone white. Her lip trembled. She moved close, pressing her side to mine. We need to call someone, she said. The police? The coroner? Her words were decisive and raw. I felt the gravity of them like a stone in my gut. But who do you call when what has been taken is not money, not jewelry, but the part of a man that felt like proof he had existed? Who do you ask to return hands that can't be reunited with a life? The question felt obscene and necessary at once. I glanced at Carter. His jaw was set. He'd been right in more ways than I wanted to accept. There were things in motion now that would not be paused by polite refusals. I bowed my head and let a single hot tear fall. The kind that lands and cools quickly on the cheek. It tasted like metal. They closed the coffin again with an efficiency that felt cruel. The lid lowered with a sound like surrender. The men placed it back into the pit, and the earth was moved to cover it with the same careful hands that had once smoothed the surface on the day of burial. The hole shuttered closed, and the cemetery tried to settle around that new, terrible shape. I walked away with Mara at my side and Carter behind us, his steps quiet on the path. The tag in my pocket bit into my skin. Somewhere down the hill, a crow called twice, then went still. I kept thinking of hands, of the small ordinary ways they speak, and of the absence that now answered me. Who takes pieces of a person when the world expects them to remain buried? And what would I do when the people I trusted to keep the dead quiet could not even do that? The paper smelled like old pages and something Daniel had touched, Tink, and the quiet of a room that keeps secrets. Mara handed it to me with 2 fingers, careful, as if the paper might crumble into a story she could not bear to finish. The single line left on it was simple and ugly in the way truths sometimes are. Debt is never buried. The words sat on the page like a small animal refusing to be polite. I read them 3 times before the shape of what they meant began to settle in the hollows of my chest. We sat in my kitchen under a light that made the counter look like a stage set. Outside, the day held its breath. Mara's hands folded around her cup as if it were the only thing steady in the world. I watched the way her knuckles whitened when she squeezed. She hadn't looked at the grave again since the funeral. She hadn't looked at me. Sometimes, losing someone folds people in different ways. Some protect by silence, some by moving too quickly, some by making lists. The note felt like a small, precise instrument used to pry open something that had been shut. Daniel had always written small notes on grocery lists, instructions on the back of envelopes, names in the margins of books. His handwriting was a habit I could have recognized in the dark. The particular curl on his Y, the way his T's leaned like people trying to hold something upright. On this paper, the hand was different, looping, tidy, deliberate. It looked practiced. When Mara told me where she'd found the slip, a book Daniel kept by his chair, it felt like someone had reached into the tidy life he'd left and rearranged it. The house kept its usual sounds, the fridge settling, a distant lawnmower, but between those noises, the paper's little sentence rang loud and thin. Debt is never buried. It suggested a past that follows you, stubborn as mildew. My mouth closed around a question that wouldn't come out. Whose handwriting was this? And why would someone mark a phrase like this for me to find? Mara pressed her thumb into the fold of the paper, then drew it back like she expected it to sting. She told me about the other letters, how Daniel had burned most, but that one had been hidden between pages because he'd told her, once, to keep any notes he might leave in that book until he asked for them back. The implication sat like a stone. He'd wanted some things kept in reserve, plans folded into a drawer for a later time. She showed me the single letter she hadn't burned. The paper was yellowed on the edges and creased where it had been folded. The handwriting was the same looping script. Lines were short. The message was oblique, but persistent. Place names, times, a few words that might mean money, or time, or persons. The ink had bled in one corner as if someone had cried on it. Or perhaps it had been left damp. I thought of the morgue tag, the knife, the notebook from the shack. Each object was a punctuation mark in a sentence I couldn't yet read. The neat script felt like a narrator's voice, calm, measured, intending to be understood by whoever found the pages. Mara's eyes filled, not with tears but with the kind of tiredness that comes from carrying more than you planned to. Who writes like this? I asked. A foolish question, because in small towns, hands are known. Handwriting betrays you the way scent does. Mara swallowed. A man named Kellen, she said finally, the name a quiet offering. He used to come around when we were younger, worked odd jobs. People said he kept ledgers. The name dropped between us like an old key. Kellen. The name landed with a weight I hadn't expected. I'd seen him years ago at the hardware store, thin, weathered. An unremarkable man who paid in exact change and left with his coat collar high. He had the kind of eyes that watch the floor when they don't want to be noticed. Mara said he'd done favors for people, mended fences, carried groceries, wrote notes when hands weren't steady. Some called him helpful. Others called him a collector of small debts. Collector, I echoed, the syllable sour on my tongue. Carter had used the word once, the collector, but I'd thought it a rumor. One of those nicknames a town gives too bad luck to make it less terrifying. Now the handwriting sat between us like a proof that someone had cataloged things people thought they'd buried along with their dead. Mara folded the paper back like a map someone had studied too long. He said things to Daniel, she murmured. Not often. Small talk, but when he did, Daniel would go quiet, like he was counting something in his head. Once, I heard them speak in the yard about a trade. I didn't want to eavesdrop. Her voice clipped on the last word, as if the memory of overhearing still felt shameful. A hush settled. The kitchen clock ticked. The world outside the window seemed too ordinary. A pickup truck rolling by. A dog barking somewhere. Inside, the sentence "debt is never buried" rearranged the furniture of the life Daniel had kept. If Kellen had been in his life, quietly marking things, what bargain had Daniel been keeping? And if someone had disturbed the grave, were they looking for payment, revenge, or a promise meant to be kept? Mara stood and smoothed her skirt, like a small, futile attempt at order. She said she'd try to think of other names, other times. Any small thing that might explain why Daniel had been keeping lists. I felt the paper in my own hands, then the single line, a seed that might grow into an answer or a rot. I folded it and slipped it into my pocket, near the morgue tag, near the knife wrapped in old cloth. When she left, the doorway framed her for a moment, her shoulders drawn in. A figure walking away with the slow tiredness of someone who's carried too many things no one asked them to. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the house breathe around me. The handwriting had given me a lead, not a comfort. It had given me a name. Kellen, a man who keeps books. A man who might tell us why a grave was opened, why things were taken, and what, if anything, could be returned. By the time we found the cabin by the river, the light was already leaving the trees. It slipped off the branches and sank into the dark water, as if the day was done watching what we were about to do. The cabin sat crooked on its stilts, wood swollen from years of rain, windows blank like eyes that had forgotten how to see. Carter stood a little behind me, one hand on the strap of his bag, the other near the lantern he hadn't lit yet. We listened to the river breathe. I remember thinking, if a man made his living from quiet fear, this is exactly where he'd come to count it. We hadn't gone there alone. We'd come carrying stories. It started in Carter's truck, dust moving in the cabin light as he drove us out of town. Mara had stayed behind. Somebody needed to keep pretending life was normal. I sat in the passenger seat with Kellen's name on my tongue and Daniel's notebook in my lap. The handwriting, the lists, the phrase "debt is never buried," they'd all begun to point the same direction. The direction of a man who never raised his voice and never had to dot in the next county over. They knew him as the one who remembers. In the diner, an old woman told us he kept no bank account but always had enough. At a gas station, a boy pumping fuel said you didn't want your name on his paper. A deputy at the edge of town called him the collector with a crooked smile. Like it was a joke he didn't enjoy telling. Carter listened more than he spoke. He'd identified the handwriting without hesitations, said he'd seen it once, in a ledger pinned behind a counter where a man had paid late for a burial. Neat, looping script listing what was owed and when it had been promised. He'd thought about it for weeks afterward. That list. The way death and debt sat neatly side by side. The road turned from gravel to dirt, then to something less defined. Trees leaned in. The river's smell came first, iron and silt, old leaves and forgotten things. When we stepped out of the truck, the sky was a throat of low gray. The air clung to my skin, thick with the sense that we were nearing the center of a web we hadn't known we'd been walking into. The cabin's door was swollen in its frame but not locked. Carter pressed his shoulder into it, and it gave with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was damp and cool, smelling of wet wood, rust, and the faint afterscent of tobacco. Dust floated in the doorway like it had been waiting for company. We didn't turn on the lantern at first. Light leaked in through the cracks in the boards, drawing thin lines across the floor. My eyes adjusted slowly. A small table, a rusted stove, a chair with one leg patched. The sound of the river pushed faintly at the walls. Then I saw the far wall. Even in the half-light, I could see that it wasn't bare. Sheets of paper were pinned there, overlapping like scales. Some browned with age, others newer, edges curling, names, columns, numbers, items. It was a tapestry of obligation. Carter lit the lantern then, its glow crawling up the wall and making the ink twitch into clarity. My feet carried me forward before I was ready. The pages breathed gently when the draft from the open door brushed them. Handwriting everywhere, the same controlled loops and hooks I'd seen on the note in my kitchen. Each page was a record. Tires paid in kind. Loan 3 months late. Favors rendered. The word owed appeared again and again, like a heartbeat. I scanned the columns, throat dry. These were not bank ledgers, they were something older. A man's memory, nailed to a wall so he wouldn't have to carry it all in his head. Somewhere in that dense forest of names, I knew, was Daniel. I found him near the middle, not at the beginning, not at the end, as if his story had been just another chapter in a long, ongoing book. Daniel Ward, it read, in that tidy script. Next to his name, a few lines, dates that matched the ones on Mara's list, the ones in his notebook. Then, on the last line, 2 words written with unusual care. The ink slightly darker, as if pressed harder into the paper. 2 hands returned. For a second, the room went narrow. The lantern's light seemed to pull away. The edges of my vision fuzzy. My knees loosened in a way that made the floor tilt. Carter's hand touched my elbow, steadying me, but it was a distant feeling. As if someone had put a hand on a photograph of me instead. 2 hands returned. The words sat on the page like a verdict. They were not a threat, they were an account. Something promised, something paid, or something stolen back. My mind ran on 2 tracks. The coffin with its smooth empty sleeves, and this wall with its careful loops of ink. Debt is never buried. A promise kept, perhaps, by taking what the world thought was laid to rest. Returned to who? I whispered, the question barely air. Carter's brow furrowed as he read the lines around Daniel's entry. Looks like there were meetings. Arrangements, he said slowly. He promised something. Maybe to keep you out of it? His voice softened on the last words. I tasted both tenderness and accusation in them. The idea that Daniel had bargained with a man like this, that he had put his own body down as collateral, it slid into me like a cold blade. It had the awful logic of love twisted into something desperate. My hands shook, and I had to tuck them under my arms to hide it. We stood there a long time, breathing with the river and the rust. On another paper nearby, I saw a different name, one I half recognized from town next to the words debt forgiven. On others, lines were unfinished, lives cut off mid. It was a wall of stories no one had wanted told out loud. Carter pulled a small notebook from his pocket and copied Daniel's entry, his pencil scratching quietly in the heavy air. We didn't touch the pinned pages. It felt like tampering with a body. When we stepped back out into the pale evening, the sky had pulled tight over the river, low and gray. The cabin door creaked as it closed, swallowing all those names back into the dark. I walked toward the truck with the phrase 2 hands returned echoing in my head. Returned to what, or to whom? I didn't yet know. But I understood one thing. Whatever Daniel had tried to pay, someone out there believed the account was still open. The note on my porch was the size of a thumb, folded, stiff with dew. It told me where to come and when. The cemetery bench at dawn. I stood there with my coat pulled tight, the morning cold like a hand pressing down. Carter wouldn't come this time. He said it was mine to meet. I watched the hill under a pale sky and listened to the graveyard breathe. When the man stepped out from behind a cedar, he was smaller than I expected and older. Like a thing that had been sharpened by patience. He didn't smile. He held a small box loose in both hands, as if it were delicate, as if whatever was inside still had a pulse. The hill smelled faintly of frost and pine sap. I had walked this path 100 times, and yet it felt as if I had never learned its rhythm. I remembered the first day I brought flowers, how the world had seemed kinder for a week. And then I remembered the day the men lowered him in, and the ground took the shape of that absence. The grave had been a boundary, a promise that some things stop hurting because they stop being visible. Now I stood outside that boundary with a man who did not belong to our town. He looked like a ledger personified, quiet, practical clothes, hands that had tended to small things so long they'd learned to keep secrets in the seams. The box in his hands was no larger than a loaf of bread. He set it on the bench between us as if placing a delicate animal down to see how it would breathe. You came, he said. His voice was a flat thing that kept its edges. He did not offer a name. Names sometimes mean debts. I sat, feeling like I was taking up room in a waiting room where the doctor had just written the prognosis. My fingers found the tag in my pocket and the knife at my waist, like talismans to hold on to something that meant Daniel. That kept him near. The man watched me as if deciding when to begin. The cemetery around us seemed to snuggle closer, listening. He opened the box with 2 careful motions. Inside, wrapped in linen, were small, folded things what looked like gloves, perhaps. And beneath them, a pair of waxed cloths. My stomach flipped. My heart loped like a horse, startled. He lifted his head and watched me. 2 hands returned, he said, soft and factual. Like a bookkeeper reading a line he'd meant to record all along. I wanted to ask how. I wanted to demand why. Instead, I found myself asking the question that had swallowed the last month's whole. Why bring them to me? The man's mouth tightened. He promised something for them, he said. Promises are accounts. Some get settled one way, some another. He folded his fingers over the box, as if it were a balance. Daniel paid in a manner you might not approve of. His eyes studied the gravestone behind us as if looking for an answer carved in the stone. I felt a pressure in my chest. There are confessions that arrive as thunderclaps, and there are the slow ones that erode you like water. This was the latter patient, inevitable. He told me then without flourish that Daniel had made arrangements some years back. He had signed, he had promised, he had counted on one man's ledger to hold what he could not keep. The collector's voice was calm. He promised to keep you from the debt. He promised his own body as collateral. The words moved through me like winter light through glass. I did not understand the math of promises, only the fact of them. Daniel had taken something on, in order to carry it away from me. That knowledge felt like both miracle and betrayal. What do you want? I asked, and the question came out thinner than it felt. The man set the box between us again and shrugged almost imperceptibly. Settlement, he said. Not always money. Sometimes the ledger seeks truth. Sometimes it seeks an acknowledgement. Sometimes it gets tired of waiting. He explained slowly, as if offering me small steps across a river, that debts in his care were often not financial. People owed favors, silence, absences returned as payment. Daniel had catalogued things. One item, the record said, had not been fulfilled. A secrecy he had promised to keep for someone else. The line beside Daniel's name read 2 hands returned, but below that, a shorthand note. If she won't pay, she must speak. My throat closed. The shape of the sentence left room for interpretation. Perhaps he'd been arranging for me to give something back. Perhaps he'd been trying to buy me safety with his own body. My chest tightened with a memory of a night years ago when a shed had burned and someone had been hurt. A night I had thought I'd closed behind me. Daniel had always been the one to stand between me and the consequences. Taking calls, mending fences, saying the right thing at the right time. Could this be the cost he paid? The collector's eyes were gentle in a way that made it worse. I can take the box, he said. I can close the ledger with my own hands. But the ledger insists, the truth must be laid down. Somewhere it will be seen. He looked at me as if offering a simple contract. Confession in exchange for silence. Truth in exchange for leave. Dawn pushed up like a question. The grave behind us was a neat cut in the land, obedient and still. I thought of Daniel, how he would have hated this theater. How he would have folded his hands and whispered we should not make a spectacle of the dead, but he'd done the work anyway. He'd stacked this account and hoped someone would never have to settle it. I sat there a long time, feeling the small box like a heart on my palm. The collector folded his hands and waited. The cemetery smelled of frost and pine and a truth I had been skirting around for years. Somewhere down the hill, a crow called once, then went silent. I pressed my thumb against the morgue tag in my pocket until it bit into skin and made me feel real. Tell me what to say, I murmured, finally not ready for the ledger to close, but knowing, with a clarity that frightened me, that the choice was no longer mine to postpone. Dawn came slow and careful, like someone trying not to wake the dead. Light threaded through the pines in thin silver ropes. And the cemetery looked smaller, somehow less like a map of losses and more like a bowl holding them. I sat on the bench with the small box between my knees, its linen wrappings smelling faintly of oil and earth. The morgue tag in my palm felt warm from where I'd been holding it. Carter stood a little back, hands in his coat pockets. The collector waited where the shadow of the cedar met the grass. We all watched the grave, as if it might answer for us. Sitting there, the world pressed into a narrow band bench box. Stone, the air tasted of old frost and the kind of clean that comes after rain. My heart felt large and awkward in my chest, like something foreign I was supposed to carry without dropping. I had rehearsed confessions in my head in the thick, small hours. Truths pared down to a single, usable line. None of them fit the ledger's sharp edge. I thought of Daniel's hands, honest, useful, and how they'd smoothed my hair the night the dogs barked, how they'd fixed a leaky pipe, how they'd held my back up when the world leaned too heavy. I thought of them as things you don't bargain with, and yet here I was, on a bench, negotiating a balance someone else had written in ink years before. The collector's face was ordinary, older than his picture. Softer at the eyes than I expected. He had the tired look of people who keep lists for a living and find that lists become their lives. He held my gaze like a man measuring whether I would trade what I had for what he offered. The box felt heavier than its size should allow, as if whatever was in it had the center of gravity of a promise. Carter's presence was a quiet chord, solid but distant. He didn't speak. He let the morning do that for him. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of my own breath. The small mechanical answer to the way fear pins you to a single rhythm. Tell him, the collector said finally, voice like paper folded and unfolded. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed spectacle. He looked like a man who had long learned the arithmetic of others' lives. Say what you will trade. The words felt blunt and necessary. I thought of the nights Daniel had kept silent when I'd asked him to tell me if something was wrong. I thought of how readily he'd taken a burden and tucked it into his pockets as if it were laundry to be done. I thought of the ledger wall in that cabin, names stapled like stops on a train, and the neat line next to Daniel's that read, 2 hands returned. Memories came in the precise, small way that confessions do, clean-edged, impossible to soften. Years back, there had been an accident at the warehouse where I worked. A light lift on, a frayed cord, a spark that found a stack of oilcloth. A man named Ellis had been there that night, helping my crew close up. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Ellis was hurt badly, burns, months in a hospital bed. I'd told the manager it was an electrical fault gone wrong. I'd told myself the truth, that I hadn't seen him step into the flame because I was rushing to save paperwork. Because I was tired, because accidents happen. Daniel had said nothing at first. Then, when the town sharpened its questions, he signed a statement, laid his name down as the one who'd been responsible for leaving the light on. He said he had been in the warehouse that evening and left the lamp. He took the attention. He took the blame. He took every quiet, hard thing to keep me from being named. I had understood it then as love. I understood it now as cost. When I spoke the words aloud on the bench, they sounded thinner than the paper they were written on. I didn't tell the truth after the fire, I said. I watched him go. I watched, and I didn't stop him from taking it. He wanted to protect me. The collector didn't react like a man surprised. He only nodded, as if this was the sort of currency he expected. Ledgers require balance, he said. Not all debts are money. He set his hands on the box and lifted the linen. Inside were the things we had been circling for months. 2 hands, carefully preserved, wrapped as if they might still clasp a wrist. They were not grotesque, only strangely small, like 2 pieces of a sculpture. I wanted, absurdly, to feel anger toward them, toward the idea that a body could be parceled. Instead, I felt the simple, terrible fact of what Daniel had done. He had laid down his body in an account so I wouldn't have to. If I give you the truth, I said, voice steadying, will you close the book? The question felt like a child's bargaining, but there was no child to protect now. Only a ledger and a woman who had learned too late. What? Silence costs. The collector looked at me with something like pity and something like respect. People settle things different ways, he said. Some write checks, some bring things that matter. He paid. He paid in the way he knew how. Your truth is an admission. It balances the ledger. I felt the words of my confession settle like coins dropped into a jar. They clinked and scraped and finally lay still. The air around us felt different, less like threat and more like a slow arithmetic completing itself. I told him, in more detail than the bench needed, about the night, the small decisions, the hurry, the rationalization. I said it not because I wanted to punish myself, but because Daniel had already done the hard part and I owed him at least that much honesty. Saying it felt like opening a window in a room that had been shut for years. When I finished, the collector closed the linen and pushed the box back toward me. Ledger balanced, he said plainly. 2 hands returned to earth. You keep your name out of certain books. He walked away then, as quietly as he had come, his steps folding into the morning like a page being turned. Carter came up and put a hand on my shoulder, human pressure that said, we did what we had to do. I held the box until the earth took it, until my fingers were streaked with soil and the grave swallowed the last of what Daniel had given. The men filled the hole with patient, steady shovels, and the mound softened under the light of day. When it was done, I stood and watched the ground seal over him. The morgue tag in my hand felt like a small sermon, proof and remnant and reminder. The cemetery settled. The pines leaned and the world inhaled. I didn't feel lighter immediately. The truth didn't make grief tidy, but there was a new shape to it. A ledger closed. A bargain finally met. I walked away with my hands empty and my pockets heavy with things I could at least name. What comes next, I do not know, but as the sun lifted higher and the path back to town lay out before me, I felt the strangest thing from not to forget, not to pretend, but to carry what remains with slightly steadier shoulders.